Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you today on this Wednesday morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. I do want to also plug one We're going to, at 8 p.m. Eastern Time tonight, a whole bunch of us are going to get together and do a stream, and we'll be raising funds for Lifeline for Gaza. So Nora Barrows Friedman, Sina Rahmani from East is a Podcast, um, Alex Avina, Dr. Laura Shihai, they'll all be joining us for that. And the goal will be to try to make sure that there are no fundraisers on Lifeline for Gaza that have not received a contribution in the last 5 days. So I did the count this morning, and there were 169, I believe, fundraisers that were in that category that had not received a contribution in at least the last 5 days. So if anybody wants to help us get started on that, feel free to do so throughout this live stream as well. And I'll put a link to that in the show description, but it's just Lifeline for the number 4Gaza.com. Good to be with you all. Make it sure to take a minute and like, share, subscribe. Sharing and liking definitely helps this conversation reach more people. And I know that the analysis of Abdaljawad is some of the best that we will hear. And I'm sure this is going to be another moving conversation. And so I look forward to that and to sharing it with folks. For those who don't know, Abdaljawad Omar is a Palestinian scholar, educator, and theorist whose work focuses on the politics of resistance, decolonization, and the Palestinian struggle. He has written extensively in Arabic, and at this point, he's written extensively in English. I don't really know. It's got to be among uh, the most publications since the start of this war back in October 7th of 2023, documenting and discussing all kinds of things related to the genocide, related to resistance, and more. And so, um, you know, this week we're going to talk primarily about a couple of his pieces that he wrote for a publication that I wasn't too familiar with, called Communists. And so we'll talk about that. Those works are published in both English and Spanish, but he also has recent pieces that just came out from Salvage Magazine, from the Monthly Review Press. Those are linked in the show description, as is a piece from Mondoweiss that we haven't talked about yet that maybe we'll touch on a little bit, about Marwan Barghouti, Ben-Gvir, and the Israeli need for humiliation, something along those lines. So anyways, look forward to it. Abdaljawad, it's good to be with you again, my friend.
Yeah, good to be with you again, Jared, as well.
Yeah, so let's start with kind of with some analysis. Start with kind of where we are with things. There's the UN Commission of Inquiry has finally declared this officially a genocide at this point. The International Association of Genocide Scholars has finally declared it a genocide. China also recently officially declared it a genocide. So there are still notable deniers, of course. The US, the United Kingdom, Germany, the EU as like a political body, and of course Israel, of course, denies that it's committing genocide. And these days we're watching the IOF send these remote controlled armored personnel control carriers filled with explosives into residential neighborhoods in Gaza City and just, blowing them up, in addition to, of course, the bombing, which has not stopped for a single day. Um, and in Gaza City, Palestinians are desperately trying to, raise enough funds to travel to the south, or, some are remaining either as an act of defiance, as an act of steadfastness in some cases, but in many others, it may just be like sheer exhaustion. Like, just there's, you know, people have been moved so many times. There is nowhere for them to go, right? And so I'm just want to kind of start there with like your assessment of, the current moment we're in that way.
Well, I mean, I think I would begin from the last thing you kind of said, which is one of the elements of my current, let's say, turn towards this kind of exposition of interiority in my writing, let's put it that way, more and more so. Creating this kind of intimate space is because there's so many things that have collapsed, no? And one of them is, for instance, something like the idea of sumud. I wouldn't say it's a total collapse, so people don't get me wrong. But when people, for instance, in Gaza are remaining Gaza, they're not necessarily exercising this kind of active political agency of sumud. No, it's also partially placed or partially the result of the foreclosure of other options available. It's the way the world is framing choices for Palestinians in Gaza more precisely, but also for Palestinians more broadly. So in that sense, I think that, there are many conceptions, many things of our past as Palestinians that have lost their ability to really explicate, the nature of our existence at this current moment or interval. And therefore, I think that language needs to now bend itself on some level, and we need to rethink, or at least rewrite our place in the world within this horrific moment that, of course, unfortunately, it took 2 years for people to call it genocide, or some people to call it genocide. Not everybody. I mean, it's good that there are some more people calling it genocide, but we should remember that still many countries don't. Many centers of power deny it. That weapons still flow into Israel, that diplomatic cover is still given to it, that many governments are not only complicit, but are willing to even, police their own populations so that this flow of arms and political and diplomatic cover continues. But yeah, I mean, this is one of the elements. I mean, Sumud, yes, there was, many attempts in the past by many Palestinian scholars to kind of delineate its contours. What does it mean to really stand in steadfastness? And there were various articulations. Partially, people have called it, there's the passive form of just remaining on the land, which does not necessitate from people, to take up arms or engage in political activities or activism or of that sorts. And there are, elements of this more active sumud, which is not one that, is happy to confine itself to things like remaining, or baqa in Arabic, but something, more active politically, organizational building, mobilization, choosing, if you want, to remain in Gaza out of wanting or having the desire to also defeat, for instance, the Israeli army, and to make sure that it cannot empty the city from its people. So there are these iterations, but I think this is a moment where some concept like that is the grounds underneath it is shaking. At least this is what we're hearing from people from Gaza, but also not from people from Gaza only, but also from the Palestinians more broadly. That these words do not have the same power. In fact, sometimes they feel to Palestinians as they are a burden more than they are something they can articulate their own understanding of the world in this kind of existential fight that we're caught up in the past 2 years, and still continues. So yeah, I mean, this is a moment where you need to rethink some of these, if you want, conception, and I think language always comes late to the game. It comes after the heroes have fought and after the people have suffered, and but for those who are immersed themselves in language, there's something that needs to be really looked upon and re-examined in this current moment. So yeah, I mean, this is one element of it. The second element is more a political analysis that, yes, indeed, there are signs that Israel is facing more isolation. And there are signs that it's facing more backlash across the globe, even from some of the European powers. We've seen, for instance, what Spain has committed to in terms of imposing an arms embargo. There's some more rhetorical declarations on the part of countries like Turkey. There's more move towards sanctions, at least in the European Union. Of course, we don't know the contours of what really will be sanctioned. And, we can really say that, Israel is facing increasing pushback, although still shy and still too late and still highly hesitant. And with some countries going a highly symbolic route of, recognizing a Palestinian state, which is, of course, an empty form of gesture at this current moment, specifically when people are asking for food and end of the war and the massacres. So yeah, I mean, Israel is facing that, and part of what it's facing is also these kind of international institutions and organizations coming up, defining terms and making these terms stick, if you want, or giving them more power of explaining across, if you want, liberal institutions more broadly. The more institutions like that take up the position that genocide is genocide, the less likely you will see, for instance, media institutions or other forms of institutions stick to their own framing on what's going on in Gaza. At least it will be more embarrassing for them, because they will be also not only misaligned with the Palestine movement, which they can throw a lot of, hubris at, but also they will be misaligned with, the framing of international legal experts, with international institutions, with this whole international system or liberal order and its own process of adopting language more broadly. So yeah, it does put them much more in an embarrassing, if you want, or perhaps in what we've spoken about earlier, how these institutions are really hollowing out from the inside, kind of imploding as they try to protect Israel, and committing genocide while also denying. So there is that element, but it's also quite, for us, there's nothing really, if you want, really comforting in it, if you want. Let me choose that word, although I might choose another word for it, but comforting, because I think all that is happening does not necessarily mean Israel will stop, first of all. Second of all, in fact, I think with the current Israeli coalition in power, there is a tendency within Israeli society, and of course its ideological underpinning since its inception, where isolation is in fact something that feeds Israeli ideology rather than actually contains it. And this is actually a structural, if you want, contradiction within Israel. On the one hand, it's this colony and outpost, small, dependent, needs the largesse of its imperial backers, like the United States in the past 50 or so years, but before that, France, and before that, the UK. And at the same time, it's a colony that has the ability to rebel on these masters, to sometimes, assassinate, for instance, British officials, or commit terrorist acts against, for instance, the King David Hotel before 48, or transgress norms or rules in place by the empire that they should not cross, or coordinating with that empire and which rules it should cross or shouldn't cross. But and in that view, in the past couple of days, we've also seen Netanyahu speak of this super Sparta, the Spartan myth, this warrior society that is only concerned with war and with the need for Israel to move into this kind of self-reliance on itself, on its own industrial base, on manufacturing its own arms, on creating the capacity for war without the dependency on other people's politics. That's a problem. That's the anxiety in Israel today, because they know that they lost the world. They know that their narrative has been displaced. They know that people are disgusted with it across the globe. And to sustain the war machine, they need to start to think of the possibility of the entire world actually taking a position where Israel does not receive the arms it needs to continue this war. I'm not saying about this war specifically, but maybe in the midterm, medium run, or long term, we could see something of that kind of radical shift in relation to Israel more broadly. So there's that kind of, mobilization of the Spartan ideal of being a warrior society, independent. And of course, if somebody's honest with themselves in Israel, they cannot do that. They cannot pull it off. It's a matter that it's very difficult for Israel to not be connected to global networks of arms importation, but also of various industrial bases that exist and actually support it and provide it with what it needs. And at the same time, even if it moves towards more reliance on itself on some fronts, it cannot actually pull everything that it wants. And in fact, in the past, even historically, Israel has attempted, for instance, to create its own aircraft or fighter jet called the Lavi, which means Lions Club, and it actually failed. Partially because even in creating its own jet, the irony, it actually, sought out American money to create its own independent jet. So there's this kind of structural tension that exists in Israel between being a dependent colony, between wanting to be independent and sovereign without reliance on other people's politics. And I'm not sure how this conversation goes, but we can say that this is one of the impacts of this war going long term, no matter what happens. How Israel chooses to act in terms of diverting some of the resources that it has towards, for instance, its own industrial base, whether it will be able to sustain its social security system as a result, whether it will need to spend a lot of money on, creating factories, or what people will be the labor within such factories for arms, whether it will be able to create its own form of aircrafts and jets and the spare parts that it needs, or it will fail as well in this end of war, and of course just try to produce niches as it does now, and of course exports to the world, niches within this arms industry and make money off of it. And I think this is one of the fault lines within Israeli society more broadly, because also for much of Israel, specifically Tel Aviv, the people who party on stolen beaches and appropriate Palestinian food and call it Israeli food and brand it across the world, they have a different view of themselves and their relationship to the world. So this is the tension between also like this kind of liberal center politics, which is still fascistic, of course, when it comes to the Palestinians, and of course this religious Zionist messianic, which actually welcomes isolation. It welcomes isolation from various points of view. One of them is this kind of mix of religion and history, in which, well, the world already hates us. This is the idea. Historically, they hated us. So this is why Israel is actually necessary, because the world already hates us. So it feeds into that kind of, if you want, psychic or ideological, and reinforces as that kind of line. But as we know, of course, on a materialist ground, Israel cannot really fully go alone, and that kind of structural dependency is quite problematic. The bad news here, of course, is because Israel has already lost the world, at least in terms of narrative and its moral shield, if you want, the facade that many people unfortunately fell for because of propaganda and because of the exclusion of Palestinian voices and because of this long history of reinforcing Israel as a cultural and political symbol in the US, for instance, or because they lost the world, there's more incentive to finish off the Palestinians. That's a problem in this interval. So the problem with it is that they might lose a lot in the coming months and years, but at the same time, that actually incentivizes more and more. The more they bury themselves within this attempt to annihilate us, and of course, it doesn't mean that they necessarily will be successful, but they might. That they are, that it incentivizes this kind of killing. And that's partially what we're seeing, for instance, in Gaza today. It's this kind of attempt to torture the Palestinians of Gaza more. Until now, it seems that they lack at least the foundations on which to completely erase Gaza in a more condensed tempo. So temporally, they cannot do it fast. Maybe we can claim that they're stuck on some level, but maybe not. Maybe there's like the surprise on October 7th, not being well prepared for this type of scenario, caught them off guard and basically meant that they're now improvising as they go on. And that means that they need more time in what to do and how to get it done. But there's more incentive to make this a form of perpetual war, where they want to see and test where they can go. The second element, I would say, Jared, as well, what is also worrying is that Israel's attack on Qatar was worrying on some level, which is, and I'm here not saying because of, Israel has been bombarding Yemen and nobody talks about it, for instance, no? It's not even mentioned. They assassinated 33 journalists in a building, massacred them, and at the same time killed the entire, leadership, civil leadership, the prime minister and ministers in a meeting. But this doesn't really create outrage, and it speaks to this kind of echo between Gaza and Yemen. The wretched of the earth, if you want to draw on Fanon, but the people who are the poorest, are the most excluded, are the most placed outside this kind of liberal flows of finance and the material underpinning of the international system more broadly, in which they're not grievable, they're not center staged, despite all their attempts, specifically in Yemen, to support the Palestinians in Gaza and its resistance. But I think one of the things we've talked about earlier, and this is something that is important for everybody to also kind of notice, is that we've spoke about how peace deals with the Arabs, the architecture in the region kind of is an obstacle towards the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, because it's a question that Israel has to ask itself. Is it willing to destabilize the region in a way that might actually harm the structure that has existed at least since the 70s, with peace deals with Jordan and Egypt being a corner piece of its own ability to be rest assured with its own president, to be stable, to have a high or advanced economy, to be able to attract settlers, to provision them with social services, to expand its market, to export. The calm in the region is part and parcel of Israel's, if you want, success in the past 40 or 50 years to attempt this partial normalization of itself in the region. So is Israel willing to undermine this or destabilize it, and to what extent? And I think these two signals, this Netanyahu speech where we're going towards self-reliance, although it's partially rhetorical, it's partially just a way to push off or push back against the pressure coming from some parts of the world, specifically on the level of the people's movement, specifically on the level of how electoral politics is changing, specifically also on the level of some governments who are taking, very few governments, but some governments who are taking some sort of position recently. And at the same time, the second element of it is that you go and attack a country like Qatar, which is very emplaced within this international system and is part of the American imperial architecture in the region. One ally of America hitting another ally of America. Of course, on the behest and agreement of America, because nobody should believe that America was not aware of what's going to actually occur in Qatar, but signaling that it's willing to do so, and of course, downsize the role of Qatar. That's part of the idea of this hit on the Hamas leadership and the negotiators. and at the same time, of course, killing the negotiator, which is also part of this infracture or transgression against, if you want, international laws and norms, in which it exercises its own form of power that tries, again, to kind of fill this void that opened up in October 7th, the void of Israel being shakeable, Israel being defeatable, that Israel is still trying on some level to actually contain and fill. And it's doing so by, exercising what other countries have chosen, at least historically, to not exercise in this highly obscene and visceral way. So I think this is part of the picture as well, is that Israel is signaling that it's willing to transgress and perhaps breach and redefine the contours of the region, not only in relation, for instance, to Syria and expanding its territory, not only in relation to Lebanon, where Hezbollah and still exists and still fighting for its own repairment and ability to at least repair its infrastructure and its military units, and trying its best to maintain itself and create the space where the capacity of resistance, at least in Lebanon, remains. But also in relation to its partners, collaborators in the region more broadly, in the ruling classes that these countries embody and represent.
Yeah, thank you. There's something in there. I mean, this is not something that I planned to kind of talk about today, but as you were talking about it, it brought up something that I've been kind of trying to grapple with lately. And I know you and I have had discussions, going back to the beginning of this, genocidal war, that there's this analysis that we have of Israel's role within the world system, right, within global capitalism and imperialism and so on. But you've also talked about the importance of things like settler affinities and stuff like that in terms of like the U.S. Israeli relationship, right? And I mean, I think on some level, I appreciate folks, Max Isle and others who have said, talking about it as a relationship at this point almost um, is too vague. It's like thinking about a body, right? And thinking about, is the hand of the body actually separate from the brain? That kind of thing. But I think one of the things I wanted to think about with you for a minute is that historically, one of the issues I've been thinking about is that there is this tension historically that you laid out in that last discussion between what the settler colonial entity is willing to do, what the people who inhabit it are willing to do, partly because of how they understand themselves, right? They understand themselves as out in the wilderness, confronting savages, right? Confronting people who are uncivilized and all of these sorts of things. Like this is part of the settler ideology, right? Is that we are the civilized people and that everyone around us is brutes or savages or whatever else, right? And that the people who are back in the metropole, our imperial backers, they don't really understand what things are like out here, right? They're too far removed from it. And they can have their liberalism there, but out here, we have to be warriors, we have to be Sparta, right? To use what Netanyahu said recently, or super Sparta. But this is a typical framework within settler colonialism, right? Of like, the US has this as well. And I think this is the thing that's historically, I don't know quite how to analyze because I'm not aware of another instance where the primary imperial backer of a settler colony at this point is also a settler colony, right? And so the United States, in its own, um, history, its own, development, right, develops initially as a settler colony. It breaks off from the British, but also its imperialism, at least in the first phases, is all a kind of settler colonial imperialism. It's all a matter of taking the land that is that it has easy access to because it is continuous with it, right? It's nearby, and exterminating the indigenous people along the way. Buying up some things from other empires and so on, but predominantly this long process of kind of ethnic cleansing, putting people in reservations and camps or killing them, right? And that is so important to how the United States kind of understands itself. And so there is not the same level uh, within the United States. There's never been the level of sort of reverence for something like international law, or this idea that you know, or being opposed to genocide necessarily, right? I mean, we tell this story about World War II, but the United States wasn't involved in World War II because it was worried about the genocide of Jewish people and communists and disabled folks and things like that in Nazi Germany, right? It had to do with more with the Japanese than it had to do with the Germans, to be honest, and with its own imperial ambitions as well. And so it's one of those things in this moment where you have, the United States, which has veto power on the Security Council, which doesn't mean that it can veto everything. The UN General Assembly can do things, without the US's input, but it hasn't had the fortitude, or whatever to do that, because they also know that going against Israel means going against the United States as well, and people are worried about sanctions or military actions against them. And like as you're talking about Yemen, we talk about the assassination of their civil government officials, the assassination of all those journalists, all of the things there, um, which of course, not to mention everything that Israel has done in terms of destruction in Gaza, which is just un it's a list that's like too long to list at this point. Um, and this attack in Qatar, like as this is going on, the United States is bombing like fishing boats off of in the Caribbean, from Venezuela, trying to claim that it's drug traffickers or narco terrorists, right? And so you have at the same time the United States also transgressing these international norms and laws, seeking to change those laws through that transgression, right? Which I think is a deep affinity between Israel's behavior and the US's behavior historically, is that um, Israel, I think, has always been more comfortable kind of transgressing those boundaries and pushing those boundaries through its action. But the United States has a plenty long history of that as well, right? Of being like really, there's a reason why we have the Hague Invasion Act in the United States, which is like if any US soldiers or people are ever brought up on war crimes, that the United States can authorize an invasion of the Hague to free them. It's a similar kind of logic that would lead a state to develop something like that, to the way that Israelis also view these international norms and laws. And so I don't know what my question is there particularly, but do you think about that relationship, I guess, in terms of when you think about settler affinities, do you think about that in terms of like we really don't have a good history to look at to say what happens when the settler colony is going off the rails, but their primary backer also has this deep settler colonial history as well, and shares many of those same logics.
I mean, I wouldn't go there. Like, I do think that what you've mentioned in terms of this kind of echo between, American history and Israeli history is, of course, very relevant. And we've talked about it a bit before, and other people have also delineated much more in depth than we did. Um, I think Steven Salaita as well was, one person who kind of returns to this kind of relationship on that level and its history. I think for me, I mean, we can see that Israel is a lab, and we said this before, a lab for ideas, ideologies, technologies, breaking norms in order to normalize new ones. And in that way, it's useful for those imperial managers who want to check and see and test what things that they can actually get away with in relation to their own partners and allies, because I don't think America really has allies. If you're an ally of America, you should be very, wary. And at the same time, in testing, socially forms of social organization, around, for example, tech, which Israel is very, advanced in, specifically in applying it to the occupied territories and surveilling us and, creating all these complex systems of, collecting data and archiving them, and of course, doing a lot of research of them and using them in intelligence, and of course, eventually in the attempt to actually collapse and break down the Palestinian society. But also that, Israel is on the frontiers of defying some of the things that actually this world is moving towards, and this version, if we don't want to be lazy, of fascism that is also the entire world is moving towards. And this is why I think the struggle of Palestine, again, does not stay in Palestine. It's not only about the Palestinians. We've mentioned that 100 times, but I'll keep repeating it, because what happens here has consequences on the world more broadly. But usually, Jared, and I agree, I mean, these kind of structural analyses are important. Political economy, material, but at the end of the day, you need to also, think, okay, why did the Americans withdraw from Vietnam, for instance? Why did the French lose out in Algeria, at least, and withdrew their settler colony? How were peoples in some, what did the dissent in the US, for instance, do to create the conditions for the withdrawal of Vietnam, alongside the longue durée of the Vietnamese resistance and struggle? So for me, these are more relevant questions. Why? Because I think sometimes what happens with structural analysis, if we just keep putting it out there, okay, they're the same body, yeah, of course, and we can make that analytical point of view, but I think we should also search for ways in which that kind of structure has to readjust or adjust or bend itself, or sometimes actually, at least in some historical moments, retreats and has to regroup and regather and think a different route towards something else. And I think this is, for me, central, at least in this moment. Central, at least for a moment, because I look at the world not only from how we should define and outline structures, but how to break them down, how to corrode them. And of course, yes, you need to understand something about the world and how it works to be able to get something, done. And what we can see, at least in this current moment, and I think this is correct to say, is that there is a shift empirically that we can test that has to do with people's attitudes towards Palestine. Is that going to become political power? I don't know. It's up to people. Will that open the road for more fascism? Most likely. We're seeing this already happening and occurring. The attack against the legal system in the US, against the Palestine movement, the banning on visas, all of this turn in which, some domestic agenda is actually useful, because it also, you can, engulf it with this kind of pro-Israel stance and move on the attack as many, as parts of at least America's right wing, because even in the right wing now, there's a fracture, at least around Israel at the current moment. So I think, yes, there is an element to which we can also point out in this history where this kind of imperial structure also kind of bends over, retreats, recoils. And I think these are moments that we should stick to, and I think this is where our thinking should go, because this is not only a moment to argue over, things alongside what is the actual contours of the structure. And I think for most of us Palestinians right now, out of this war, the only thing we can point out concretely that we're kind of garnering is this change and shift in world's attitude. I mean, that's the only thing that people agree. Okay, there's one thing that we've, that's the only thing that gives us some fragment of hope, although hope betrays us every day. But that gives us some fragment of hope. And maybe it's foolish. Maybe we shouldn't hope for anything to change. But this is my fear sometimes with like heavy structuralist analysis, is that although they might be very accurate, and perhaps you should look at the truth in its face, what they fail to do is that they don't open some sort of horizon for actual political change. And I do think that there's a big space, for how dissent and for how the conversations over Palestine could in fact, at least, I don't know, create the conditions for some sort of political shift in some point in the future. Again, this might be, again, naive. We might come back to this years and find this foolish Palestinian from Ramallah saying something quite naive. But I mean, this is one thing that we point towards. And I think there are precedent against this, because also in Israel, there's no dissent. There's no real dissent against the war. Even if there is dissent, it's engulfed with the idea of retrieving, the bodies of Israeli captives and some of the captives that remain, or the prisoners that remain alive. So this is the dissent. It's a dissent that is self-centered. It's not necessarily a dissent against the genocide. There's very few voices. Some Israelis are speaking out, but very few. Some of them actually, when they also speak out, do operate not from a genuine position, but also in a way like what Haaretz does, which is to bring up or produce this kind of liberal face of an English-speaking newspaper to the world. That still is heavy on Zionist propaganda in its analysis and takes and framings and etc., but can still be critical, and therefore people, specifically among the progressive lefts across, or some of the liberals across the world, attuned to or tuned towards for some analysis on Palestine, Israel. So some of it is also kind of like performative and just done to redeem themselves as persons, or to redeem Israel actually through this kind of weird inner critical voice, and therefore we're redeemable. But I think that if it was if it was me, this is what I would focus. Now, having settler affinities, having religious fantasies around Palestine, having a lot of different histories entangled in it, whether it's the history of Jews in Europe, or whether it's this kind of retrospective narrative of clash of civilization, Islam versus Christianity, Islam versus the West. Yeah, I mean, it does come. This place starts to feel heavy. I mean, it's burdened with all these different fantasies and ideals and people's, I don't know, turning towards this place to pray. It's really just a small place with some hills and quite diverse ecosystem, but it's nothing really special. I mean, even it's quite weird. You go somewhere else in the world, it could be much more beautiful than this place. But the only thing that I would say is that yes, we can draw on these kind of affinities, and I do see this moment as also a moment where kind of Europe, and of course by extension the United States, is looking towards, some within these countries are looking towards Israel at a moment where their own sense of dominance of the globe for the past 500 years is coming under increasing strain. The question is arising. Let's put it. You have a country like the US, which has enormous debt. It's feeding off this the dollarization of the global economy. And we see China encroaching and taking its place at the center of the global economy as well, with its own version of politics, of course, and own version of what it means, to be part of the international system. And perhaps in the future, the Chinese will advance some sort of vision of what they want to see more in the world in terms of, relations between people. I'm not sure it's going to be very different than what we have, but at least that's one part of it. And I think, whether it's this kind of competition over technologies, whether it's the sense of the alliance increasing, warmth between China and Russia, slightly less, but also Iran, other countries that could be folded into the mix. The West is feeling that there are countries that are rising and that their dominance is coming to an end. This doesn't mean it will end. And that in the next century or so, that these types of things that we see go on in Gaza are things that might need to be repeated elsewhere. And this is where Israel is also useful for those. And so we need to return to 19th century and 17th century. We need to return to these moments where violence can be that brutal, that killing of children is not a very does not create a lot of outrage, where wiping out cities is part and parcel of what warfare means. So I think that in that sense, yes, I do see that Israel is playing a foundational role moving forward in whatever in whatever outcome politics have in the imperial court, because I think it's still in a question. Because I think we could go a different direction. We can go towards a managed relationship between different parts of the world. We can go to end Israel's regime of ethno supremacy and create a different horizon for also people's relationships across the world between Europe and the rest of the world, specifically with the Muslim and Arab world. Generally, we can heal. That is also part of the future. That is also a possible part. Maybe it's a weaker part of the future, but that's also a possible outcome of the current moment that we're living through. Maybe now I can't see it. A lot of people share that, at least on the level of sentiment, because we're living in the darkest days, and I think the darker days are still coming. But yeah, it is, and I think this is why it's imperative today more than ever for people who are thinking about the future, not only political, not only in terms of ideology, but of making families, whether it's in Philadelphia or here, or their children or their loved ones, or that we kind of come up, or we try as much to organize and create the conditions for a real fight, at least against these fascist forces and those who are backing imperialism in this way. And to really corrode their power. This is imperative. Not only to stop the Gaza massacre that is happening, although that's also imperative and of course more urgent than ever. But I think that's also perhaps one of the byproducts of October 7th. It reminds everybody of the agenda in the coming future on climate, on environment, on what it means to allow populist right-wing governments to take over. We see their version in Israel. This is what it means. It means mass killings, it means massacres, it means using power, transgressions, remaking the world in order to maintain dominance without any sort of legitimacy coming with that dominance. And I've always, with many of my friends, I always, you always, whether it's international relations or whether you always have these two concepts together, soft power and hard power. Okay, now we're just getting hard power. Brutal, if you want, hard power. There's no soft power, with it. Like Israel does not have real soft power. Like nobody likes Israel, at least on the level of, today's global opinion. And of course, whether it's in the Arab world, whether it's in the, even in the imperial core, most people are coming to terms that Israel is committing a genocide, that it's committing horrible war crimes, that it's transgressing every norm's rule, trying to break them to make the world in its own image as well, to normalize this kind of transgression. And people are repulsed, and people are taking position, and we see more people taking positions every day, whether in the cultural domain or what. But at the same time, I think that it's such a profoundly critical moment and interval that we're living in, that people miss the point if they stick to only looking at what's happening in Gaza and failing to really stop it, and don't understand that what happens in Gaza will not stay in Gaza. Not only will it go to the West Bank, of course, because we're kind of waiting our turn, but at the same time, it will go across the globe in other parts of the world. So maybe Gaza was the first, at least for a modern European power like Israel to commit a genocide in the 21st century. This is what I mean by first. I'm not saying that there's no other genocide happening, fueled, of course, by also imperialism and divide and conquer strategies across Africa and other places. But at the same time, I think, this is a version of the future that we're seeing unfold in Gaza, and I think we should make sure that it does not unfold somewhere else as well. So this is what I fear when we talk about settler colonial affinities. It's not only about how much investment psychologically do some people, in the US have, or does, this kind of ideological hold of the American story, that echoes or bleeds through Israel's story, because these are discourses that can also be dismantled and deconstructed, and and people could also we humans are amenable. I mean, we can create a different narrative, and yeah, there are echoes there. The Wild West in the US, the frontiers, the being free by going across the desert, I don't know, somewhere in Nevada and killing people. There are these echoes of the pioneers and all of these remaking the continent in in a European image. There are these affinities, but there's also or it's incumbent upon us as well to understand that discourses have limitations. We cannot just speak of them only and exclusively as a reason why people back Israel, because again, this is where I agree with materialist understanding. Israel does something for those in the empire, specifically at the moment where the empire is becoming insecure. It's like, let us chart for you the way. Yes, it's brute. Yes, it's horrible. Yes, people will cry and people will be outraged. But look, we can get results and we can still sustain the dominance, and we still inject ourselves with some sort of temporal defer of our collapse. And we can send a message to the globe. If you mess with us, this is what happens to you and your people. That is at least part and parcel of this moment. And this is why I think the struggle over Palestine is important, but also what it tells us about possible futurities for for the world over. And this is something I really worry about. I'm not only worried about us as Palestinians, but I'm also worried, well, not only about the region, which is Lebanon and Syria and Egypt as well, and Jordan, but and other places as well in the region. I also worry about what will happen in places like Venezuela, or what would happen in places in Latin America, or what will happen in places in Africa, or what would happen in Asia, and what will happen in we're coming to more dark days, just more broadly. And if there's not really peoples to people, not only solidarity, not only sentiment, not only circulation of ideas, and if there's no people to people also organizations and mobilizations and work done across that builds some sort of capacity for organization, and of course transferring that into political power, the right will win, and the right will shape the world in a way I think we would hate all to see. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think in this moment, as worried about, all of the ways that, all of the dark days ahead, and all of the ways that those possible futures could play out, as I've ever been. And, I think in a lot of ways, Abdul Jawad, you and I like both share this kind of, um, tendency towards hope, or towards finding the thing that we can attach ourselves to see the positive futures, and I think that's essential work. But as you said, like right now in these times where things are as dark as they are, I think that's as hard as it's ever been, which, as you also point out, is why it's also as important, or more important than ever, to continue to keep that work alive. So yeah, thank you for all of that. So I want to delve into a couple of your pieces, and we'll start with this piece that you wrote, "Death has died in Gaza." And there's this notion in it that for much of the world, it would just be easier if Palestinians did not exist. And you talk about a vanishing, about people who, um, travel away from Palestine, who toy with leaving, the difficulty of that as well. And one of the things you speak about is this tension that exists between imagining this vanishing, and the models we have of it, whether Quranic or biblical, as something that's like swift and brief, right? Some kind of cataclysmic event. And yet, what Palestinians face or have been dealing with, right, is this long, drawn out, torturous condition where the Israeli colonizers and their global backers want Palestinians to disappear. But as you talked about in your earlier statement, like for some reason, they don't quite have the whatever to just do it, right? So it becomes this kind of dragged out process that's quite excruciating, right? And the we've talked about, you know, time as a factor here, the temporal expansion of this. Um and so in that piece, one of the things you talk about is this exchange between a friend in Gaza where she says, quote, "Don't worry, soon you will not have to hear from us." And in that piece, you end up exchanging the phrase, quote, "Don't worry, we will vanish after you." So can you just share a little bit about this piece and, the meaning of the exchange for you?
Yeah, it's I think that, again, I think one of the things I've been doing a lot, which is analysis, and it's a way to look at the world, when you try to analyze, or um it's not necessarily, you try to look at actors and entities, and how they interact. You try to look at, you try to subtract from the world whatever data, if you want, at least on some level. No, you're trying to bring, forward history into the analysis. Sometimes maybe psychoanalysis, sometimes maybe something around concepts. And I think recently, and I've always written, like, more pieces like this, but in Arabic as well, but also at times in English, and which is like a more testimonial fragments of the various, if you want, conflicting affective ways of receiving the world at this current moment, and trying to actually, as much as possible, if you want, touch the impossibility of language, or touch, you know, that domain where of how to frame this moment, of how I don't think we can encapsulate it in language, but to try and reach the closest we can towards this kind of moment or interval of horror and destruction. And there's a lot of conflicting emotions, if you want. It's not like one, like it's the dark humor, it's the cruel jokes between men, it's the relationship to home, it's the idea of the city and the micropulse we live in, for instance, in Ramallah. It's the nature of the conversations we're having. It's saying how are you and what it means. So there's a lot of different ways in which we're interacting with this moment, in this awkward position, of course, where I am, which is within the domain of the genocide, because you can sense it coming your way, no? But at the same time, outside of it for the moment. So, of course, it doesn't mean like outside of it in a total sense, but Ramallah is still not being bombarded from air, or deprived from food, or systematically being turned down, or destroyed physically and otherwise. So you're in that awkward position. Of course, you have some people from Gaza, or you talk to, and friends, and of course, people in Gaza and Palestinians in Gaza are quite angry with people in the West Bank, rightfully so, of course, because of the incapacity that they have seen of the Palestinians in the West Bank to do something more proactive in relation to the what's happening in Gaza, to relieve them, perhaps, to come to their rescue, if you want. or to attempt forms of resistance, although that's not totally accurate in terms of the description, because there are always attempts at resistance here. Some are even organized, but I don't want to go into the West Bank and its condition. So some of the conversation turns towards that. I mean, it's the sense that, Gazans are crying out for somebody to save them, somebody not only to witness and sit down and not do anything, but to participate actively. And at the same time, feeling the sense of burden of just continuing to scream into screens, to take pictures and videos of the crimes, feeling the sense that, despite all that is happening and all the death and killing and the hunger and the playing food roulette, the world is not really moving towards ending this genocide. And people, whether in the Arab world or in the West Bank and Jerusalem and inside and Palestinian citizens of Israel, or those even in the Shatat or diaspora, are failing to come to the fore and be in a much more organized form of politics. This is the intra-Palestinian conversation, but just more, it also go back to the region and, the lack of. So Gazans are starting to feel that, their voice doesn't really matter. And that's one level of it. The second level of it, I think all Palestinians share. Maybe we don't share in a sense of, most Palestinians at least share, is that you don't want to look at your people being killed and feel you can't do anything about it. Like so that from the outset, like I have always felt from the beginning, a sense where I just wish we all die, instantly. And we don't have to go through this whole one by one thing and this interval and this kind of, heavy moment, a heavy, who goes first and who dies first, and Gaza now being destroyed, you're next, that type of world that we're living in this current moment. So from the outset, I even wrote something in Arabic when, Israel unleashed a lot of bombardment along those lines, as, I wish death will come at us once, and it's done. Because it's quite, it's quite a life we have. I mean, we've normalized things that we shouldn't normalize, We have this cruel framing of choice. Basil Araj celebrated it a bit. He said, Palestine gives an existential meaning. It's true. But it comes with also a heavy burden. And it's a burden that continues to be placed on your shoulders as a people, to stand steadfast, to, think of power, to, bear immobility, to be not welcome to the, also we don't have, nobody's opening their arms to receive us. That's the other, a cruel thing about our world, is also the Israelis want to kill us and ethnically cleanse us, and nobody wants to have us. Even the Americans, denies us visa, at this current moment. So I mean, so it's a weird space to live in, and that kind of space comes with these kind of, if you want, fantasies for collective vanishing, or out of exhaustion, out of feeling that if the world will be happy that we're gone and everything is okay, fine, just do it fast, finish it off, have some mercy, and do it fast. So yeah, I mean, that is an utterance that we utter, and to be honest, I think it sits with each one of us, or at least most of us. Of course, there are more people who are more defiant or have a different sense, but I think this is a very unnerving moment, a very tense, full of anxiety for all of us. And not only because it's an existential fight, and not only because we don't have it in us to fight. I mean, we have. I mean, me writing this, people shouldn't have read it as some sort of defeatist, mantra. But also, it's people are exhausted. There's that as well. We're living in this domain of post-exhaustion, specifically in Gaza. That's why I told you, like, sumud doesn't really operate as a defining word today. It's the same as, also in the West Bank or wherever you are, somebody who's not necessarily by birth Palestinian, but also have been part and parcel of, sitting along and feeling Palestinian, at least in his heart. There's exhaustion all over. And of course, even in exhaustion, you don't have the luxury of rest. Like, you don't rest. So it's one of those things where the frame of choice we have, where the world we inhabit, is telling us this is not a world for you. And sometimes it's more than natural and normal for those who receive that signal from the world, that message repeatedly, either through bombs or visa denials or being treated horribly at borders, or being denied the right to organize even in the imperial core as Palestinians, or being cracked down and attempted deported, that would, like what happened with Mahmoud Khalil and other Palestinians in the U.S. When you live that type of, if you want, of struggle in a world where Palestinians are excluded and not permitted, I think that there's an element of it which is that, yeah, maybe it's better if we disappear. Now, having said that, I did come to also this out of sheer, it's sheer sentiment, sheer emotion. It's not but how do you articulate them? Like, that's my, that's where I think language could use. How do you articulate this collective death wish? How do you notice it in people's eyes or in utterances, and how do you forge, some sort of thing around it? And what haunted me, of course, while speaking to my friend, was that she said in Arabic, "Al-Maut mat fi Gaza," which means death died in Gaza. And it was a strange framing. I didn't hear it before. I think it was there before, but I never really actually encountered it. And yeah, that was the thing that we were speaking about our choices, our lives, etc., what she wants to do. And then she said, death has died in Gaza as we were speaking. And it just continued to linger with me for a while. And then I wrote that piece, articulating these different threads, if you want, together, about leaving and going, about the idea of what it means to take a breath outside of Palestine, about how, there's different threads, different tense threads within it that don't really resolve, but they're there. I mean, for people to read and take a look. And it's a conversation, at least, that is more about these kind of conflicting, if you want, affective poles that we all kind of face at this current moment. And one of them is that what we're seeing is unbearable, and we shouldn't be seeing, at least if you're in the West Bank, and what people are in Gaza enduring. And they're enduring this kind of moment where the end is already there, or they're inhabiting this domain of the end, is that in that type of interval that shouldn't be there. It's an interval that you wish you just don't live through. That's the idea.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for writing both of these pieces. I mean, I think that, like I hesitate very much to claim that, like, too much emotional resonance with it, because it almost feels like, and I think probably a lot of folks feel this way, is that we don't deserve to feel emotionally resonant. Like, we're not experiencing these things as closely as you are, or as certainly as Palestinians in Gaza are. But nonetheless, like, you tap into, I think, a lot of sentiment and emotion that on some level, like, people who give a shit, people who care, like, are experiencing, in just being stretched beyond kind of what you thought was possible, in terms of um yeah, just like, I don't even know. I mean, you're just in this place. So I just really appreciate you putting words to it. I shared it with folks. Everybody that I shared it with or saw, sharing these pieces, I think, felt that you tap into some really important things and name them and give language to them. So I just want to thank you for that. And somebody also said in the chat, like, this anxiety is also felt by the impotent bystanders. And I think that that's kind of, the point, right? Is that there's also a shame, and we've talked about this along the way. And it's not a shame that I want to wash away, because I think it's a shame that we have earned in terms of our own, inability to, put together, to move our sentiment and our feelings and our political aspirations and so on into some form of action that has the ability to change this. And I think that, that shame in some ways is a productive shame, in the sense that I hope that it translates into us figuring out, what we need to do differently, um as we move forward, and as quickly as possible, but also for the long term as well. Because like you say, and unfortunately, I don't think that this I think that there's a paradigm shift here that we need to be sensitive to, that has long-term implications as well. um the other thing I just wanted to say on what you just said is, it also does remind me a lot of aspects of Cedric Robinson's book Black Marxism that don't get taken up as much as he's grappling with the Black radical tradition and what it actually means. Is that one of the tendencies that he talks about, that isn't even discussed that much in people who talk about the book Black Marxism? There is this radical tendency, this tendency to fight back, to articulate resistance, to have freedom dreams, and to go towards marriage, right, or fleeing, right, to create your own communities and so on. But he also talks about this tendency to self destruction, this tendency for collective, whether it's enslaved people jumping off slave ships together to drown themselves together so that they don't have to endure what they're enduring anymore. Or he uses examples in Africa among, like, the Xhosa people of, collective cattle killing from African people, doing it because what they were enduring from the colonizers was so horrendous that they wanted to produce a kind of cataclysmic event where they would all kind of collectively die. And he just talks about how these kind of events still evade Western analyses and interpretation, basically, that there's not really a language that has been developed within the Western academy and thinking to deal with that kind of, like, the level of violence and harm that would produce such an impulse, right? A collective impulse from people. Um, I have other questions, but I don't know if you want to respond to that at all.
I mean, yeah, I mean, no, I think that that's quite correct. I mean, there's a lot of, even in Fanon, you can see it in like in psychoanalysis, also in Cedric Robinson. Also, like, it's quite, it's part of responding to a world where you feel kind of in a constant humiliation, where you're reduced to this form of survival mode, like, where choices are framed in a specific way, where you feel like where you're carrying on your shoulder such a weight. And it's easy, for instance, to find, okay, maybe I disidentify with myself as Palestinian. Some Palestinians have chosen that route by trying or pretending to be Israeli if they have Israeli citizenship, for instance. So there's different forms that this kind of death takes place. It could be symbolic, ideational. It could be on the level of also turning violence inwards, instead of outwards, instead of exploding in the face of the colonizer. I think part and parcel of what you can say is this kind of slow death process is the Palestinian Authority. It's one of those things. It's a Palestinian Authority that takes the gun into its own head and shoots itself in the head, not as a tragic thing, but as actually a conscious, if you want, form of choice in the wake of the defeat of the PLO. I think there's some resonance with all of these things. and also with what you've described in terms of, people. I think when you were talking about, you know, Africans being dragged in ships and them deciding to jump, I think this is more the resonance there. It's this idea of, I don't want to bear this life, or I don't want to bear that struggle, or affirm a world in which, for instance, people are kidnapped and dragged into ships and then sold into markets in North America, for instance. So in that sense, yes, there is that kind of radical rejection of the world as it is in its affirmation, rather than this kind of slow, symbolic, if you want, death, or committing suicide by turning against your own people, or these structures, not only the Palestinian Authority, but even in the region more broadly, that uh, you know that speak of, for instance, the need to reconcile with Israel on terms that Israel wants. And of course, they can't even answer the basic question of what actually Israel wants, because you know we don't know. We don't know to what extent it wants to expand, dominate, hegemonize. What would make Israel more secure, secure enough that it does not, kill more people, for instance. So nobody knows, even those that are in alliance with Israel, and they're trying to sell Israel in the Arab world, whether in Lebanon or Syria or in the Gulf or in Jordan or wherever you might be across the world. So there's that resonance, yes. I mean, and it's a question. I mean, I think, if you go to philosophy, I mean, the idea of suicide is the um, one of the most, important philosophical questions, because either you affirm life or you don't. Like, um, uh, not that we should talk about this, but that's part of you know part and parcel of anybody. Everybody, I think, comes to that question at some point in their life, like, and grapple with it. But yeah, anyways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I should say too regarding, the instance of Africans jumping into the ocean on slave ships is that there was also connected to it, and Robinson talks about this and others have as well, but a belief that they would go to a better place, like that what they were being taken to was so horrendous that the alternative would be also a better place. It wasn't just about kind of a self-annihilation thing, but also there was also even beliefs that they might return to Africa, right? And so like that's also, I think, an important thing. And I think it's something that comes about when the conditions of life become totally unlivable, right? In such a way, which is connected to what the Zionist entity and the United States are trying to produce in Gaza, in terms of this concentrated effort to make Gaza totally uninhabitable, which we've talked about before, and so I do want to move on to one of the other pieces. Um, so Water Without Name, another great piece, same publication. It's a really moving piece about Palestinian manhood dealing with, unspeakable violence, shame, torture, grief, without the space to mourn, like, which is something that you've talked about. We talked about in one of our earliest conversations about how, Palestinians are not granted the time that would be necessary to really mourn. Um, and there's one part in it that I kind of wanted to talk about, which is this exchange with a friend who has been imprisoned and tortured and recently released. So I'm going to read this quote. My friend recounted his ordeal, but what seared was not the words, never the words. It was the silence, the lacuna that announced itself in their interstices. Not what he said, but what was withheld. Those moments locked away, barred from narration. Nakedness, exposure, suffocation, incapacity. States we recognize too well that we await almost masochistically while pretending with violent insistence that they do not occur. In those intervals, he was not merely lonely, but utterly alone, abandoned to an extremity of solitude, stripped of the minimal recognition that sustains a self. Deprived of voices of others who could affirm existence, he hung suspended in that void, the dungeon, where even the possibility of address collapses, where being is starved of witness, end quote. And so on the one hand, you're kind of working with through rituals in the piece that you and others engage in to confront, to not confront the sort of trauma in a way that would, bring tears to your eyes, which is another thing you talk about, is just like the kind of stigma around crying, basically. And on another, you're dealing with what it really means to perform manhood and what tears mean, and both the limits of what they can accomplish, what they do for us, but the temporary relief that they do provide. And so there's a lot more in that piece, but I just wanted to ask you kind of what kind of brought you to writing this specific piece, and if there's anything that you wanted to say about it.
Well, I mean, it's the second piece. I mean, so one of the themes that I'm trying. I mean, I've been writing a lot of, I don't know, I told you this kind of a bit before, but I've been writing a lot of, again, analysis or theoretical pieces and things like that. And after a while, it gets kind of exhausting to write those type of pieces. You start to, I think, search for a new language to speak, or a new way to like articulate at least some parts of your own, let's say, experience in the world, confessing if you want, and pouring yourself out on paper, and not really putting a lot of inhibitions about what you're sharing, your ideas, conflictions, if you want, notions. And I think for whatever, maybe on some level, I'm doing that out of sheer, I don't know, some sort of survival, even beyond, bodily death, if you want. Just placing myself more at the center of the, although I think it's also self-indulgent, and as I write to the piece, it's like maybe something I shouldn't do. But I think I'm trying to create a space of intimacy. And I think that that's a space where you have to like share part of who you are for people to feel kind of connected to you as well. And I think intimacy in writing can also touch people in ways that other forms of writing does not, if you want. So there's kind of a trick there, but it's not a trick in a bad sense of the word. Like, I'm trying to infiltrate your hearts, and in a way that is defiant, but yet also sad, if you want. Not necessarily broken, but not necessarily collapsed, but also at the same time that can articulate something raw and real, and infiltrate your mind without knowing that it infiltrated you, like sit with you and haunt you. So that's part of why I'm writing this, and part of it is also my own relationship to the idea of being a man. Like, that's the idea, at least in the piece, just generally, but also weaving into it, what it means for men to be around each other in Palestine, and how, if you want, masculinity itself, first of all, is shattered under colonialism in many ways, and redefined in many ways as well. But at the same time, how it comes to grow as a burden for somebody like me, somebody who cannot cross over to become a hero or something like that, too cowardly to do that, feels stuck, suffocated, also cannot completely recoil. So you're in that kind of zone that kind of enunciates some sort of impasse, if you want, or an impasse. And so on that level, I think it's also kind of my cry against being a man, but also about the idea that men don't cry or men don't leak. And I call it leaking because we don't cry. Like, that's the that's how you don't cry, at least intentionally. You leak kind of suddenly, and it's a saturation that comes without you knowing why it comes. And there's something around men and crying that has that kind of level to it. So I tried to name it as leaking, of course, and throughout the piece, just speak of this relationship of when I leak and why and how, it also interrupts, relieves, propels questions later on, and at the same time, kind of juxtaposition this kind of unnatural coexistence between yourself and being a man as a performance, and if you want, in the social sphere more broadly. And I think on a more sociological level, the very basic idea in the piece is that, yeah, I mean, there is quite a problem that I see, and also not a problem because I participated in it and I confess to that as well, which is we do not take things seriously. Like somebody just coming out of hell, and we find a way to make jokes around it. And of course, this is comic relief. It's necessary. I mean, you can't take things seriously, and as the passage you read about the friend, like you can see the pain. You sit with him, you can see the pain, you can see the feeling that he saw something that he shouldn't have witnessed, that he suffered through something that no person should have gone through. At the same time, the only way to deal with that is through this kind of black humor, cruel jokes. Even recently, I mean, for people who are interested in it, when Palestinians were being dragged into Al-Karim, into these lines and being, captured by Israeli soldiers, they were actually also making jokes on each other as they were, moving through. They were not taking that moment seriously, and I've seen that even within the moment. I've also witnessed it and gone through it, and I think it's a very natural reaction. So in the piece, it doesn't come out kindly, but I think it's a very natural reaction to these conditions to laugh at it. And it actually shows something of defiance, but also of ability to kind of disentangle the power of those who are performing power, no? But at the same time, the problem with it is that kind of normalizes and does not leave specifically men with places where they can actually share that space or create that space of intimacy where pain can be, if you want, disentangled more seriously. So there's that something, this kind of disturbed relationship that I have personally with being a man and what it means to be a man in Palestine, because even the idea of being rijal, being a man, is also being, strong, protective, fighter, somebody who could withstand prison and could withstand horror and torture, and who would fight and would be willing to give up his life. Like these are all the things that come with being, if you want to call yourself, at least in the resonance within the street, when we say Rijal, this is what, kind of is anticipated from a man. And at the same time of, of how kind of colonialism kind of fractures that, I mean, this is also what happens to a man when he cannot be a hero. That's the question. What happens if he cannot actually, or does not want to die, for instance, or feels a sense that, maybe life is worth living more, like, what happens when you are faced with these kind of intense limit, tests that are placed on your body and your manhood. And so these are things that I think are kind of the subtext of the piece as well. It's a conversation with things in my life, but also with people in my life, and with my cry against the masculinity of or being, or trying to perform that form of masculinity, specifically as you deal with these kind of different, if you want, conceptions and understanding of what it means to be a man in the context of Palestine specifically, but I think also it resonates perhaps in other contexts as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, it absolutely does. We have so that's kind of my questions, but I think we could talk a little bit more. I mean, what we talked a little bit about kind of the analysis of the current situation at the beginning of the podcast too. Um, I know that the UN in particular has shown itself to be like such a kind of a farce, right? In many ways, I know that it's not something that Palestinians in particular tend to look to as their potential savior because they've seen how much, for instance, Israel really doesn't care, right? Doesn't have any respect. Calls the UN an anti-Semitic institution, so on and so forth. I'm interested in. Do you have any like you talked about how we constantly kind of feel betrayed by our hopes. And I think that's something that I wrestle with a lot is like kind of all the times over these last couple of years where I have felt hopeful and then how stupid I've felt after the fact for being hopeful. um and so then I kind of, beat up on myself over that. Like why well, what was wrong with you? Why didn't you know that that wouldn't lead to anything, that wouldn't mean anything. um but I'm curious for you, like, are you tracking some of the discussions around the upcoming UN summit? Does any of that interest you? Does it figure into your analysis at all at any level?
Well, I mean, the Palestinian Authority seems excited about the prospects of much of the world recognizing Palestine. It doesn't interest me that much because I think that, unless there's real concrete steps, whether it is the provisioning of actual sanctions on Israel, or, which could not necessarily immediately, but at least in the long term, actually change radically the way Israeli society approaches. At least it will make it reckon with and pay consequences for the crimes it's committed. So there's some sort of justice within it before anything else, but also it could enter the calculus as something that would help stop the war. And the third, which I think is important, it could actually perhaps shift the calculus of some of the political and economic elites within the state of Israel. Therefore, perhaps creating the space for something else, but this zero-sum game that they have chosen to play. But other than that, I think, Jared, like, it doesn't really interest me because I think one of the problems that we have Palestinian-wise is that we have a highly inept PA that goes along with the world without really pushing forward things that are important, even on the front of legal warfare, etc. And them kind of like sticking to this idea of Palestinian state being recognized without moving towards, forms of even using these kind of minimal tools like, of course, to be fair, I mean, the PA did play a role in, like, advancing the Palestinian case in the ICC and ICJ and all of these different avenues, and they still do. But in pushing the countries more and more towards, sanctions, and sometimes what I fear the most, and this is where the structural condition that we also face is that our very representatives and their, and their diplomatic work is also contingent on American, Israeli, and European financial prowess and support. So you have this kind of tense contradiction, and we've seen that happen in the past where we make advances in international organizations, like the UN, like courts, like with some of the reports that came out of the first Gaza war. And then eventually the PA itself is the one that would actually ruin that process. I think now, because there's more interest among some of the countries to manage dissent at home, that these kind of symbolic gestures are being rehearsed. They want to show that they're like signaling some sort of moral affinity with the Palestinians, trying to ease the descent of much of their populations against the genocide. So it's coming more from the West than actually actively pursued from the West specifically, but also from other countries than actively pursued by the Palestinian Authority. But of course, this whole dynamic means very little in terms of what's happening on the ground or the future of the struggle if it's not really met with an arms embargo, with real sanctions against Israel, with the cutting of diplomatic relationships, with cultural isolation of Israeli institutions, so that the entire Israeli state, including its various organs and institutions, understands really the consequences of what it means to commit genocide in the 21st century. So an empty gesture like recognizing Palestine, okay, and then you ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. So what? It's akin to the Balfour Declaration. Maybe I mentioned that earlier, where Balfour declares a Jewish homeland that preserves the rights of those who live there. But of course, Israel did not safeguard the rights of those inhabitants. Of course, it denied us any form of, nationhood, etc. But it says that okay, you can create a Jewish homeland as long as you safeguard the rights, civil and economic, and of those minorities that live within Palestine. But they ethnically cleansed the Palestinians. So for me, I don't think this whole state recognition is anything even worth to actually give that much time. Yes, on some level, it signals where the world at. It disturbs the Israelis a bit. I'm not saying I'm like, standing here with a banner against the recognition of the state, but it does not really make any kind of real breakaway, and just gives Israel actually more time to commit the genocide without any real consequences, as countries signal an empty gesture instead of real action.
Yeah, and I should have said a little more because I agree. I'm less interested in the conversation around state recognition. There is a discussion underway. I think it's Colombia that has talked about putting this forward, and I hope that on some level, I hope that it makes its way to the floor of the UN, so at least countries are forced to vote on it. But this question of deploying a protective or a peacekeeping force, which obviously is something that the U.S. and Israel would deny, but they can through the General Assembly do that without Security Council veto. And I'm just curious if you've followed that at all, and if that there are some people also, like some Palestinians, who don't think that it would do anything helpful at all, and actually might just make things worse on some levels. But yeah, I didn't know if you followed that at all or had thoughts on that.
I really don't have I don't have a deep take on it. I haven't really followed up, so I don't want to share preliminary thoughts that would be more disorienting than anything else. So yeah.
Yeah, no, fair. Is there anything else that you wanted to share or say before we wrap up?
No, I think I'm good. I think I'm good. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, Abdaljawad, thank you so much again for your time and for this conversation. It's always good to be in conversation with you. Folks, I do encourage you, if you will be awake at 8 p.m. Eastern. I don't know, where you are in the world and whether that's possible. I know Abdaljawad will be sleeping, but come through and join us for maybe, yeah. Come through and join us tonight. We'll be trying to raise money for Palestinians in Gaza through Lifeline for Gaza, and it should be a good conversation. We'll be talking about stuff that pisses us off mostly. It'll be myself, Sina Rahmani, Nora Barros Friedman, Alex Savinia, Lara Shihai, and perhaps some other folks will join us as well. So anyway, I hope to see many of you tonight. But Abdaljawad, again, thank you very much. This is great.
Thank you, Jared.